Good evening, friends. I'm glad you're here tonight. Before we begin, go ahead and dim your lights, loosen the corners of your blanket, and let the hum of the room settle around you. If this calm journey helps you unwind, you can tap like and subscribe, only if it feels right. Now, let's drift backward in time together. To October 1962, when the world almost ended, quietly. Imagine the air of a cool Washington evening. The leaves have turned bronze and red, and somewhere beyond the Potomac, a single street lamp flickers like a heartbeat. Inside the White House, a young president named John F. Kennedy paces softly across the carpet, the heel of his shoe whispering with each turn. He's thinking about Cuba, an island not so far away, but suddenly filled with Soviet missiles aimed like invisible fingers toward the United States. If this sounds dramatic, don't worry. It's going to be gentle here. History, after all, is better told in whispers than in explosions. So let me tell you how the Cuban Missile Crisis began. Not with shouting generals, but with a photograph taken from 21 miles above the Earth. A U-2 spy plane, silver and serene, glided over the Caribbean sky. Below it stretched turquoise waters and green sugar fields. The pilot, Major Richard Heiser, wasn't thinking of nuclear war. He was probably just wondering what he'd have for dinner when he landed. But in the camera mounted beneath his aircraft, the film was already capturing shapes on the ground. Long, tubular, suspicious shapes that would soon make headlines and heart rates rise. When the photographs reached Washington, analysts spread them out on a table under fluorescent light. "Those aren't barns," one said quietly. "Those are missile launchers." And just like that, the Cold War, already a long, uneasy chess match between America and the Soviet Union, suddenly felt like it might switch from theory to reality. The world did not explode that day, though. Instead, it began to hold its breath. Somewhere across the Atlantic, in a grey building in Moscow, Nikita Khrushchev stirred sugar into his tea and stared at a map of the Caribbean pinned to the wall. He had placed those missiles in Cuba to protect Fidel Castro's new government from another American invasion, like the failed Bay of Pigs attempt the year before. Defensive, he called them. Provocative, said Kennedy. Two leaders, both with nuclear weapons, both telling their people to stay calm, while privately writing speeches that trembled like autumn leaves. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the quiet tick of the clock in each capital, the rhythm of a world that didn't know if morning would still come. Castro himself was sleeping little those nights in Havana. The salty air carried the buzz of radios translating news from Washington. Che Guevara, ever the restless revolutionary, walked along the seafront, pipe in hand, the glow of tobacco reflected in his glasses. "If they attack," he murmured, "we fight." Yet even Che, fierce as he was, paused to watch a fishing boat sway on the calm water, its lantern a small golden planet in the dark. Perhaps he, too, felt the strange stillness that covered the world like a blanket. Meanwhile, in American living rooms, families gathered around black and white televisions. The Kennedy administration kept silent for several tense days. Children went to school under autumn skies, none the wiser that nuclear missiles were being assembled less than 1,000 miles away. Teachers graded papers, mailmen delivered letters, and cats napped in sunny windowsills. The calm routines of a civilization balanced on the edge of something unthinkable. When Kennedy finally spoke to the nation on October 22nd, his voice came through the radio with a slow, deliberate cadence, firm yet careful. like a parent choosing every word before bedtime. This government, he said, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Around the world, cups of coffee froze halfway to lips. People listened as he announced a naval quarantine, a polite term for a blockade around Cuba. No missiles in, no ships out. The Atlantic suddenly became a vast chessboard, dotted with destroyers and submarines. I like to think of the ocean then as an enormous mirror, catching the reflection of two nervous superpowers. Beneath the waves, submarines hummed softly, their crews whispering over headsets. Above them, gulls drifted on the wind, blissfully unaware that humanity's fate depended on men blinking at radar screens. In the Oval Office, Kennedy leaned over a map where red pins marked Soviet vessels. "If they cross the line," an admiral said, "we'll have to intercept." The president nodded, then glanced at a family photo on his desk. Jackie, Caroline, and little John Jr. He breathed in, long and slow, and for a moment the room was silent, except for the faint crackle of a fireplace. It's easy to forget that even the most powerful leaders still listen to the sound of wood burning when they think. Across the sea, Khrushchev received the news of the blockade with a heavy sigh. "The Americans have encircled us," he told his aides. But he also knew Kennedy's tone, restrained, not aggressive. Both men, though miles apart, seemed to share an unspoken wish to avoid nuclear war without appearing weak. It was like two grandmasters trapped in a stalemate, each trying to find a move that wouldn't flip the board entirely. Night after night, telegrams flew back and forth. One letter from Khrushchev pleaded, "Let us show wisdom." Another threatened that American aggression would meet a devastating reply. The messages were as inconsistent as human moods. Hope one moment, fury the next. History textbooks summarize it neatly, but imagine the sleepless aides translating those words at 3 a.m. The scratching of pens, the murmur of typewriters, the clink of teacups cooling beside stacks of classified paper. And through it all, the citizens of both nations kept living. In a small diner in Florida, someone ordered pie. In a Moscow apartment, a grandmother stirred soup and turned up the radio. The world might end tomorrow, but tonight there was dinner, laughter, and perhaps a lullaby for the children. That's the strange duality of the atomic age. Existence balanced on a hairpin, yet daily life pressing on, gently and stubbornly. By the seventh day, American destroyers had surrounded Cuba. Soviet ships approached, carrying who knew what beneath their decks. Kennedy's naval officers watched radar screens with hands folded, waiting. And then, silence. One by one, the Soviet ships slowed and turned around. The blockade line remained uncrossed. It wasn't peace yet, but it was a pause, a single calm breath in a storm of uncertainty. Even the news anchors seemed to speak softer that evening. "The situation," one said, "appears to be easing." A small sentence, but it probably helped millions sleep that night. Still, Kennedy and Khrushchev knew the crisis wasn't over. The missiles were still on Cuban soil, their warheads pointed toward American cities. As I picture that fragile October night, I like to imagine the soundscape of both capitals. In Washington, the steady tick of a grandfather clock in the hallway. In Moscow, the rustle of birch trees outside the Kremlin walls. Two great powers, two nervous hearts, separated by oceans and ideology, yet connected by the same primal wish to see another sunrise. And you, listening here, can perhaps feel that echo. The hush of collective breath, the long pause before diplomacy found its footing. Because what saved the world then wasn't a missile or a miracle. It was patience. Men sitting in rooms talking slowly, writing letters, waiting for replies. History's most dangerous moment passed not with a bang, but with a cautious exhale. So rest easy, friend. The world has teetered before and chosen balance. As we drift from this tense first act toward gentler chapters ahead, let the ticking clocks and distant radios fade into the background hum. Imagine the earth turning quietly beneath a sky still full of stars. Stars that neither America nor the Soviet Union could ever claim, only share. And as we leave that anxious week in October 1962, let your thoughts settle like the dust after a long conversation. The crisis isn't over yet, but the first breath has been taken. Now, close your eyes a little tighter and let's drift onward to the island that started it all. Good evening again, friend. If you're still awake, thank you for staying with me. If you've drifted somewhere between the present and the past, that's all right too. This story will wait for you. Go ahead and loosen your shoulders. Maybe adjust your pillow just a little. Outside, let the night sound like a soft ocean. Tonight, we're floating south, across gentle waves, to the warm, moonlit island of Cuba, the stage on which the world's heartbeat quickened in 1962. Imagine the island at dusk. The scent of sugarcane hangs in the humid air, sweet and slightly burnt. Palm trees sway in a slow rhythm that could lull anyone to sleep. In the small cafes of Havana, radios hum with boleros, soft, romantic songs of longing and revolution. Somewhere near the Malecon seawall, fishermen pull in their lines under the flickering glow of gas lamps. It's a night like any other, except history is quietly tightening its grip. A man in fatigue steps out onto the balcony of a modest home in Havana, a cigar glowing at the corner of his mouth. His name is Fidel Castro, and though the night breeze is warm, he feels a chill he can't quite name. Down the street, guards whisper and boots scuff against the cobblestones. Cuba, newly reborn from revolution, stands proud, but also terribly alone. Only a few years earlier, in 1959, Castro and his companions, among them a fiery Argentine doctor named Ernesto Che Guevara, had overthrown the old regime. The victory parades had been full of music, laughter, and doves released into the blue sky. Yet, as the cheers faded, new troubles arrived. The United States, suspicious of Castro's alignment with socialism, began to frown across the Florida Strait. And in the great halls of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev leaned back in his chair and smiled. Two worlds saw the same island differently. For America, a threat. For the Soviets, an opportunity. For Cuba, perhaps, a promise of survival. Let me tell you something about islands. They live between isolation and connection. Every wave that reaches their shores brings something new, sometimes a gift, sometimes a storm. Cuba in the early 1960s was just such an island, proud, restless, and caught between giants. During the day, Havana was bright and loud, vintage cars rumbling past pastel buildings, cigar smoke curling through open windows. At night, though, the city softened. Guitar chords drifted through alleyways, laughter echoed under balconies. Che Guevara often worked late into these nights, surrounded by papers and maps, writing about the future of the revolution. He believed in progress, education, healthcare, and equality. But he also knew those dreams needed protection. Protection in 1962 meant missiles. When the Americans staged the Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961, it had been a disaster, an echo of hubris washed up on Cuban beaches. Castro had watched the smoke rise from the coastline and promised it would never happen again. So when Khrushchev offered an alliance, a chance to install Soviet missiles on Cuban soil, Castro didn't hesitate. "Let them come," he said, and perhaps he meant both the missiles and fate itself. Imagine that conversation in Moscow months later. Khrushchev's deep, rumbling laugh as he slapped a map of the Western Hemisphere. "If they can have missiles in Turkey," he said, "why can't we have missiles in Cuba?" It was logic delivered with the warmth of a bear hug and the subtlety of a chess master. So began a quiet operation known to the Soviets as Anadyr, named after a river in Siberia chosen precisely to confuse Western spies. Shipments of agricultural machinery began to leave Soviet ports. Inside the crates, though, were missiles, sleek, silent, and deadly. The ships crossed the Atlantic under calm skies. Crews told they were simply delivering tractors and trucks. Even history sometimes sails under a false name. Meanwhile, in Havana, the ports became busier than ever. Cranes clanked, dock workers sweated under the sun, and officers in crisp uniforms inspected paperwork no one dared question. Castro walked the piers one afternoon, watching crates being loaded onto trucks bound for the countryside. He knew the stakes. He had seen the photographs of Hiroshima, the headlines about the nuclear arms race. Yet he believed, perhaps stubbornly, that this was the only way to ensure Cuba's survival in a world divided by fear. Che Guevara didn't entirely disagree, though he found irony in it. "We make a revolution to escape the empire," he joked to a friend. "And now we guard the empire's weapons." He puffed on his pipe, eyes narrowed, as if watching the whole world from a chessboard made of cigar ash. Still, he admired the resolve, the audacity of placing Soviet missiles just 90 miles from the United States. It was like hiding dynamite in your neighbor's garden and waiting to see if he noticed. As the weeks passed, Soviet engineers in khaki uniforms appeared in Cuban fields. They worked in the heat, digging silos and assembling launch pads, often under mosquito nets. Villagers nearby thought they were building new sugar warehouses. The workers smiled politely, but spoke little Spanish. They were there to build what Khrushchev had called a shield of peace. In reality, that shield looked very much like a sword. Now, imagine the sensory landscape of that secret construction. The rhythmic thud of hammers, the metallic ring of wrenches, the murmur of Russian voices under the tropical sun. At night, the jungle hummed with crickets, and the engineers sipped warm vodka, swatting at mosquitoes the size of coins. Sometimes they wrote letters home, careful letters, never mentioning missiles or danger, only interesting work and beautiful weather. History, as it turns out, often hides inside ordinary sentences. Back in Washington, though, those same fields soon appeared in the grainy black and white photographs from American reconnaissance planes. And thus, as we heard in our previous chapter, the stage was set for confrontation. But tonight, let's linger just a little longer on the island itself, because beyond the politics and the power, there were people, real people, living their quiet lives. A schoolteacher grading papers by candlelight, a farmer tending sugarcane, wondering why soldiers now patrolled the edges of his land, a baker kneading dough before sunrise, hoping the power wouldn't go out again. Beneath the layers of ideology, Cuba was still Cuba, warm, musical, alive. One evening, Che Guevara visited a rural clinic newly opened under the revolutionary government. He spoke softly to the doctors, admired the worn but clean stethoscopes, and told them, "Every healed child is a victory." It's a line rarely quoted in the textbooks, but it stayed with me when I first read it, because it reminds us that even in the shadow of missiles, life insisted on going forward. Fidel Castro, too, had his gentler moments. In quieter hours, he would walk the gardens of the presidential palace, feeding koi fish in the pond. He once told a reporter that he found peace watching them circle lazily beneath the lilies. "They don't know about the Yankees or the Russians," he said with a half smile. "They only know how to swim." That's the side of history we rarely hear, the human rhythms beneath the headlines. The sound of someone's footsteps echoing in a hallway, the hush before dawn in Havana, the scent of guava drifting from a kitchen window. These are the tiny details that make even the most dangerous stories strangely soothing. By late September 1962, the Soviet ships had nearly completed their deliveries. Missiles stood ready under camouflage nets. Radar systems flickered to life. A few Cuban soldiers, unaware of the full plan, joked about guarding giant cigars for Fidel. Above them, the tropical sky turned the color of rum and smoke as evening fell. Castro, standing again on his balcony, could see the lights of ships far offshore. Somewhere out there, he knew, were American eyes watching back, spy planes, submarines, maybe even the soft pulse of sonar pings beneath the waves. The island had never felt so small or so significant. If you close your eyes, you might picture that night, the soft buzz of insects in the cane fields, the faraway hum of engines at Guantanamo Bay, the warm sea air drifting through open shutters, stirring the papers on Castro's desk. And beyond it all, the awareness, gentle but insistent, that Cuba had become the center of the world story. So many things in life come down to location, where we stand when the tide turns, which shore the waves choose to strike. For Fidel Castro, it was this island, this moment, that defined him. He wasn't a saint, nor a villain, but something far more human. A man who believed he could bargain with destiny and win. In a few days' time, Kennedy would see those photographs, and Khrushchev would receive messages written in the quiet hours before dawn. The Cold War would tighten like a violin string stretched to its limit. But for now, let's linger here, on this warm island night, where ambition and anxiety dance together in the soft candlelight. As the sea sighs against the shore and the stars shimmer above the Caribbean, imagine yourself there, listening to the rhythm of waves against the seawall, the soft strum of a guitar drifting from a cafe. The world beyond may be bracing for confrontation, but here, for this moment, there is only the calm before history's next breath. And now, as you rest a little deeper, let us leave Fidel beneath his balcony stars and follow the ripple that will soon reach distant offices lined with clocks and maps. Let your thoughts drift toward those men in suits, far from the tropics, who will soon decide how close the world will come to the edge. Good evening once more, my friend. If your pillow has grown warmer, turn it to the cool side. Take one slow breath in, one soft breath out. Tonight, we're stepping away from the humid streets of Havana and into rooms heavy with carpet, coffee, and consequence, where paper, not gunpowder, ruled the fate of nations. Picture a quiet dawn in Washington, D.C., October 1962. The sky outside the White House is pale gray, the kind of color that makes you pull your coat tighter. Inside, the lamps burn low. The scent of tobacco hangs in the air like a thought that won't leave. A small group of men, some young, some gray at the temples, sit around a long table. They are the ex-com, Kennedy's inner circle, though committee sounds far too lively for how tired they look. Papers rustle, coffee cups clink. Someone coughs softly, embarrassed by the sound. History often begins like this, not with thunder, but with a polite throat clearing at the head of the table, President John F. Kennedy straightens his tie, though there's no one here he needs to impress. He scans a set of aerial photographs, tiny white rectangles on a dark background. A general leans in, tapping a pencil. "These," he says quietly, "are nuclear launch sites." Operational soon, Kennedy nods but doesn't speak. He simply exhales, as though trying to fog up the past so he doesn't have to see it clearly. Across the ocean, in the Kremlin, the mood is similar, but the wallpaper is redder. Nikita Khrushchev sits behind his cluttered desk, surrounded by teacups and maps of the Western Hemisphere. He has a farmer's hands, broad and restless, and a politician's patience, which is to say, not much. He drums his fingers on the desk. "They will bluster," he mutters, "but they won't attack." An aide nods dutifully, writing nothing down. Somewhere in the corridor, a clock ticks with the solemn rhythm of an orchestra tuning its strings. Between these two men, Kennedy and Khrushchev, lies a conversation conducted in letters, maps, and long silences. The world calls it diplomacy. I call it the world's most stressful pen-pal exchange. Let's linger a moment on the atmosphere inside those offices. In Washington, aides move softly so their shoes don't squeak. Outside, the autumn wind shakes the magnolia trees. In Moscow, the samovar hisses gently, releasing curls of steam. Each capital hums with the same unspoken question. How close are we to nuclear war? Yet neither side can ask it out loud. It's like naming a storm before it arrives. Kennedy, ever the orator, prefers measured words. He drafts a message to Khrushchev that begins almost tenderly. "Dear Mr. Chairman." It sounds like the start of a polite thank you note, except this one concerns the survival of the species. Khrushchev replies, with equal ceremony, "Dear Mr. President, you are worried for Cuba. We are worried for Turkey." The letters cross paths in the transatlantic air, carried by couriers and cables, like doves who aren't sure which way peace is. I sometimes imagine the messengers themselves, anonymous clerks who never appear in textbooks. A young man in a wrinkled suit, carrying a sealed envelope marked top secret, weaving through Moscow traffic on a frosty morning. A secretary in Washington, typing so carefully that each keystroke sounds like a heartbeat. They too were part of the great machinery of caution. Back in the Oval Office, the ExComm debates for hours. Military advisors argue for an airstrike, swift, decisive, neat. Diplomats plead for patience. Kennedy listens, chin resting on his hand. He was a man who preferred sailing to shouting. He'd seen war before. He knew its smell. So he sits there, quiet as a lighthouse, letting everyone's words crash around him until the storm of opinions finally tires itself out. Only then does he speak. "Let's try a blockade first." Give them a chance to think it's a calm sentence that saves millions. Still, the mood in the room doesn't lift. Someone jokes weakly about the coffee being radioactive. No one laughs. Outside, a reporter waits for rumors. Inside, another general draws lines on a map like a tired teacher circling misspelled words. The air feels thick with chalk dust and destiny. Meanwhile, over in Moscow, Khrushchev is also drawing lines. Literal pencil lines connecting Cuba to Florida, Florida to Washington. He wonders whether the Americans truly believe he'd press the red button. He doesn't want war, he wants respect. To him, the missiles are not aggression. They're punctuation marks in the long, rambling sentence of the Cold War. He tells his advisors, Kennedy is clever. He's young. He will not destroy the world over pride. Then he yawns, wipes his glasses, and tells everyone to go home and sleep. No one does. Let's zoom out, just for a moment, to the ordinary people caught beneath these invisible maps. In New York, taxi drivers tune their radios to the latest updates, their headlights slicing through fog. In Moscow, street sweepers brush away early snow. In Havana, fishermen mend nets under the glow of hurricane lamps. All around the planet, humanity continues its small, stubborn rituals, proof that life keeps humming even as leaders hold their breath. Now, imagine the letter Kennedy sends on the 10th day. It's long, deliberate, almost poetic in its restraint. He appeals not to politics but to shared humanity. Let us not go down in history as the men who saw no escape from destruction. You can almost hear his Boston accent softening the word destruction into something less sharp, more like a sigh. In the Kremlin, Khrushchev reads that line twice. He sets the paper down, looks out the window at the grey Moscow morning, and says quietly, he writes like a priest. And perhaps that's exactly what the world needed at that moment. A sermon, not a speech. For all their differences, the two men shared one unlikely bond. Both had known war. Kennedy had served in the Pacific during World War II. Khrushchev had marched with the Red Army at Stalingrad. Each had seen enough loss to know that no victory tastes sweet when cities are ashes. That memory, buried under medals and rhetoric, flickered again during those tense days. Meanwhile, the generals on both sides grew restless. In the Pentagon, hawkish voices whispered, if we strike now, we can finish it. In Soviet command posts, officers rehearsed launch procedures just in case. It was like watching two sleepwalkers approach each other on a narrow bridge, neither daring to wake the other. Through it all, Kennedy kept insisting on talking. He called it a back channel, but really, it was a lifeline, a secret line of communication between Washington and Moscow using trusted intermediaries. One of them, a mild-mannered journalist, carried verbal messages between ambassadors, sipping endless cups of lukewarm coffee in dim hotel lobbies. It's strangely comforting, isn't it? The idea that global catastrophe might be postponed thanks to caffeine and courtesy. In those days, time itself seemed to slow. Television anchors spoke in hushed tones, as if too loud a voice could set off the missiles. Children practiced duck and cover drills under school desks. In Florida, families packed suitcases just in case. Yet there was also an odd, steady calm, like the eye of a hurricane that refuses to move. The world was frightened, yes, but also united by that fear. For once, everyone wanted the same thing, another tomorrow. And through this shared anxiety, small gestures began to matter. Kennedy sent word to avoid provocative maneuvers near Cuba. Khrushchev ordered Soviet ships to slow down, not challenge the blockade. Each gesture was like placing a single feather on the opposite side of a trembling scale. Late one night, Kennedy sat alone in the Oval Office, the room dim except for the lamp over his desk. He looked at a globe, one of those large ones with brass meridians. He spun it gently, watching his fingertip trace the path from Washington to Havana, to Moscow, and back again. The globe turned slowly, silently, a perfect planet of paper. Somewhere out there, submarines prowled, missiles waited, but here, under the lamp's glow, there was only the faint smell of wax and wood polish. He whispered to no one, "We just have to hold on a little longer." The words dissolved into the stillness. Across the sea, Khrushchev did something similar. He left his office late, stepping into the cold Moscow air. The night was quiet except for the rumble of streetcars in the distance. He looked up at the moon, a pale coin above the Kremlin towers, and thought how odd it was that the same moon hung over Washington, over Havana, over every frightened child in every basement shelter. For a moment, the old revolutionary smiled. "We are all fools under the same light," he said, and went back inside. By the 12th day, the correspondence between the two leaders had grown warmer, almost friendly. They began using phrases like "our mutual desire" and "for the sake of peace." It was diplomacy by lullaby. Behind the scenes, deals were forming. The Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba. The Americans, quietly, would remove theirs from Turkey. No victory parades, no declarations, just a mutual sigh of relief written in invisible ink. The world wouldn't know those details for years. What mattered then was the feeling, the way the air itself seemed to exhale. Ships turned back. Soldiers stepped away from their launch keys. Radios played music again instead of bulletins. In homes from Boston to Moscow, people let out breaths they didn't realize they'd been holding. If you're listening in bed, you might feel that same release. The body unclenching after tension you didn't know you carried. It's the same sigh the world gave in October 1962, when letters and calm voices triumphed over missiles and megatons. And so, as we close this chapter, imagine the scene. A desk scattered with half-empty teacups. A pen resting on unfinished correspondence. A window cracked open to the cool night. Somewhere, in the faint distance, a radio plays a slow waltz. The crisis is not yet over, but the worst of it has passed through words rather than war. Now, let your thoughts drift from those maps and men in suits. Ahead lies the sky again, the wide, cloud-touched horizon, where planes once flew and courage was measured not in speeches, but in silence. That's where we'll go next. For now, rest in the hush between messages, where peace first found its breath. Good evening, dreamer. If you're hearing my voice again, that means you've stayed or drifted back, and that's enough. Go ahead and sink a little deeper into the quiet. The lights outside might glow faintly through your curtains, but let them blur, let them soften. Tonight, we're climbing upward, slowly, gently, into the pale blue above the island where history once held its breath. The sky above Cuba in October 1962 was the color of secrets. From the ground it looked serene. Pelicans gliding over the coastline, clouds curling like soft wool over the sugarcane fields. But far above that peaceful picture, silver shapes traced invisible lines across the heavens. American U-2 reconnaissance planes gliding at the edge of space, cameras clicking quietly. Those cameras would bring back the photographs that changed everything. Yet up there, it was calm, almost spiritual. Imagine the faint hiss of oxygen through a pilot's mask, the steady vibration of the fuselage, the earth curving gently below like a sleeping animal. The pilot's name was Rudolf Anderson, though most people didn't know that until much later. He was a quiet man from South Carolina, polite, methodical, someone who ironed his flight suit even when nobody was looking. On the morning of October 27, he climbed into his aircraft at McCoy Air Force Base in Florida. He thought it would be just another flight, another slow orbit above an island that seemed to hold the whole world hostage. He didn't know it would be his last. Let's pause there, not in tragedy, but in stillness. The engines hum. The sunlight flickers against the canopy, and the island unfolds beneath him. Rivers glinting, roads thin as pencil lines, Havana a scatter of white along the northern shore. Down below, Soviet soldiers are drinking bitter coffee in half-built bunkers. One of them squints upward, shading his eyes. A tiny glint, nothing more than a bird to most, but to them, it's the sky's warning. They radio in the sighting. orders ripple through the humid air, translated between accents: Russian, Spanish, nervous. A colonel hesitates, wiping sweat from his forehead. He's been told not to act without Moscow's approval. But the tension of the past 2 weeks has stretched every nerve thin. Somewhere between confusion and fear, a surface-to-air missile crew prepares to fire. In Washington, Kennedy is in a meeting when the news arrives. U-2 aircraft lost over Cuba. The room freezes. No one breathes for a heartbeat. A single downed pilot, they all know, could unravel the fragile thread of peace they've spent 13 days weaving. Kennedy presses his fingertips together. "Let's not respond yet," he says softly. "Not yet." That phrase, "not yet," may be the most important 2 words in modern history. But before we reach that moment's aftermath, drift back with me a few hours to dawn over Havana Harbor. The sea was calm that morning, its surface barely rippling. Fishermen cast their nets, watching the sky grow gold. Children walked to school, shirts tucked neatly in, pencils clinking in their pockets. A Cuban mother hung laundry on a rooftop line, humming a lullaby her grandmother once sang during another uncertain time. Down the coast, the Soviet missile crews were finishing their breakfast. No one knew that within hours, the island's stillness would be pierced by a sound that would echo across continents. The missile launched, streaking skyward, invisible at first, then a flash. The U-2 shuddered. Anderson never had a chance to react. For an instant, he might have seen a ribbon of light curling up toward him. Then nothing but sky. Below, the Soviet officers stared upward, horrified by what they'd done. "Do not report this," one muttered. "Maybe it will be forgotten." But nothing in history ever truly disappears. It only drifts until someone notices the ripple. In Moscow, Khrushchev was furious. He slammed his hand on his desk. "No one was to fire," he shouted. He knew that one accident could ignite the fuse of global war. In Washington, Kennedy kept his voice even. He met with his brother Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, who was also his closest confidant. "We can't retaliate," John said quietly. "If we strike, they strike back. Then it's over." Robert nodded, eyes dark with worry. It's strange how often the world has hung not on armies, but on conversations between brothers. Outside, the White House lawn looked ordinary. Tourists snapping photographs, squirrels chasing each other near the fountain. But inside, time itself seemed fragile, like a clock made of glass. Kennedy walked to the window and stared out at the clear blue sky. Somewhere out there, another pilot was still flying. He wondered briefly whether Anderson had seen the horizon one last time before the flash. Then he turned back to his desk and said the same words again. "Not yet." While the sky trembled, Cuba remained a paradox of calm. Radio Havana played soft music, perhaps to steady the nerves of its listeners. Che Guevara, restless as always, paced along the seawall, watching American ships through binoculars. He later wrote that it was like waiting for thunder after lightning. Even he, the revolutionary, who once declared he was ready for nuclear sacrifice, seemed subdued by the magnitude of it all. Maybe because he understood something profound, that once unleashed, no ideology could control fire from the sky. Meanwhile, deep beneath the waves of the Caribbean Sea, something even more precarious was happening. A Soviet submarine, B-59, drifted silently in the dark. Its crew had been submerged for days, exhausted, overheated, and out of contact with Moscow. They didn't know if war had already begun. Above them, American destroyers dropped harmless depth charges, signals to surface, not to kill. But the men below couldn't tell the difference. The captain, believing they were under attack, ordered the preparation of a nuclear torpedo. The decision required the consent of 3 officers. 2 agreed. 1 refused. His name was Vasily Arkhipov, a quiet man with calm eyes. He argued, pleaded, insisted that they surface first. Eventually, the captain relented. The submarine rose, gasping for air and reason. History might never have recorded his name if he'd stayed silent, but that act of refusal in the dark belly of the sea may have saved the world. While all this unfolded unseen, the sun continued to rise and set over the island, unbothered by human panic. In the countryside, farmers kept harvesting cane. Children played baseball in dusty lots, their laughter mingling with the distant drone of airplanes. To them, the crisis was a word on the radio, not a shadow over their future. It's always this way. History thunders in one room, while the rest of the world hums lullabies in another. Back in Washington, the day stretched into another anxious evening. The ExComm reconvened, voices low but urgent. Maps spread across the table again, red pins like small wounds in the Caribbean. Kennedy listened, silent as before. He tapped a pencil lightly, rhythmic, almost meditative. When one general pressed again for an immediate strike, Kennedy looked up slowly. He didn't raise his voice. He just said, "There's always another way. There has to be." That phrase hung in the air like a hymn. Across the Atlantic, Khrushchev was writing another letter, this one longer, softer. He called Kennedy a reasonable man and suggested an exchange. Soviet missiles out of Cuba, American missiles out of Turkey. He didn't yet know Kennedy was already considering it. Sometimes peace arrives not through genius, but through coincidence, like 2 melodies accidentally harmonizing across a long distance. And so, while the world stared at the sky, peace began quietly beneath it, written on paper, carried by couriers, whispered in corridors. A deal in progress, fragile as a paper crane. But let's pause again and listen to the soundscape of that week's final night. In Havana, distant drums from a radio broadcast, waves tapping against the harbor wall. In Moscow, the low hum of heaters and the shuffling of typewritten pages. In Washington, crickets outside the White House, a dog barking once in the cold. No explosions, no alarms, just the quiet symphony of a planet waiting to see if it would still exist by morning. And through it all, the sky remained endlessly patient, watching over everything, over frightened presidents, anxious soldiers, hopeful families. When historians call it the closest the world ever came to nuclear war, I like to think of it as the moment the sky decided to stay blue. The next morning, Kennedy received Khrushchev's proposal. He read it in silence, lips moving slightly as though the words were prayers. Then he looked at his brother. "This could work," he said. Robert nodded, and just like that, the path forward began to form, one that led away from fire and toward the fragile calm of negotiation. Of course, the missiles didn't vanish overnight. It took weeks for them to be dismantled and shipped back across the Atlantic. Photographs confirmed their departure. Anderson's name was quietly honored. The pilots still flew, but their routes grew wider, their hearts lighter. The island below remained the same mosaic of color and rhythm it had always been. And if you stood on a hill outside Havana that November, you could look up and see those planes again, but this time without dread. They were just birds of metal, drawing invisible lines between peace and remembrance. When I think of that chapter of history, I don't picture the missiles or the speeches. I picture the sky, because it was above that sky that everything was decided by a single pilot, a single submarine officer, a handful of calm voices across the airwaves. They didn't win medals or monuments. They simply kept breathing, kept choosing patience. So as you rest tonight, imagine that same sky stretching over you, quiet, endless, forgiving. The same stars that watched over Kennedy's study, over Khrushchev's office, over Che Guevara's balcony. Stars that gleamed indifferently while humanity argued, and that now shine with the same ancient calm. History, it turns out, is often just the story of people learning to pause, to wait, to say not yet until the moment passes, and the sun rises again over a world that almost ended. Let that thought settle in your mind like dusk on calm water. Let the hum of the room be your distant airplane, your heartbeat a soft engine gliding above the clouds. You are safe here. The sky held, and so did we. Now, let your imagination descend slowly, gently, back toward the earth, toward the cities and hands that signed peace into being, because our next stop will not be in the air, but on the ground, in the 13 quiet days that shook the world. But for now, let's rest here in the lingering calm of blue above blue, where the sky above Cuba finally stopped trembling. Good evening again, traveler of soft histories. You followed the story through storms and silence, and now we've arrived at the heart of it. The 13 days when the world forgot how to breathe. If your blanket has slipped, pull it back over your shoulders. Let the air settle around you like a page closing. Tonight, we'll drift through those days not as a countdown to catastrophe, but as a slow unfolding. Each hour a petal revealing patience instead of panic. The morning of October 16, 1962, began almost politely. In the White House, a staff assistant hurried down the corridor carrying a manila envelope marked "Eyes Only." Inside were the first clear photographs of Soviet missile sites in Cuba. Kennedy looked at them without blinking. He didn't shout. He didn't even stand. He just said, "So, it's real." Outside, Washington went on making coffee and catching buses. The world's balance had shifted by the thickness of photographic paper, but no one could feel it, not yet. Those 13 days are usually told as a timeline of threats and telegrams, but if you listen closely, you can hear something softer beneath them, the pulse of humanity, steady and unsure. Let's walk through them slowly, as if strolling a quiet hallway lined with clocks. Day 1. Kennedy gathers his advisors. The room smells of pencils, wool suits, and strong coffee. Maps spread like tablecloths. Voices overlap. The word nuclear lands with a hush each time it's spoken. No decision yet. Only the awareness that every possible decision feels wrong. Day 2. News still secret. Kennedy attends public meetings, smiling faintly for the cameras. Inside, he's calculating distances. Havana to Washington, 800 miles. He imagines the curved trajectory of a missile, a line drawn faster than thought. That night, he writes notes in his diary that no one will read for decades. Resolve and reason, he scrawls. 2 words that sound like twin candles in a dark room. Day 3. A soft rain falls over Moscow. Khrushchev eats lunch in silence. He trusts that the Americans haven't discovered the missiles yet. He's wrong. Still, he spends the afternoon dictating letters about tractors and harvests. History enjoys irony. Day 4. The XCOM debates again. Someone suggests bombing the sites before they become operational. Kennedy says, almost wearily, and then the room quiets. Nobody answered, because everyone knows the next step after bombing would be war, and after war, nothing. Outside, autumn light spills through the windows, indifferent and gold. Day 5. The first ships of the planned blockade begin to move. Sailors hum songs to calm their nerves, folk tunes from Alabama, jazz riffs from New Orleans. Far away, Soviet crews sing different tunes, but the same kind of songs. Music becomes the invisible bridge across an ocean of suspicion. Day 6. Kennedy calls the British Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan. Their voices crackle through the transatlantic line like ghosts whispering across tin cans. Both men are careful with tone, calm, paternal, faintly tired. "I think we can hold them," Kennedy says. "Hold them, yes," Macmillan replies, "but don't hold your breath." They both chuckle, though neither finds it funny. Day 7. The word blockade changes to quarantine because lawyers say the former might count as an act of war. The difference is linguistic, but language can save lives. Kennedy practices his television speech in a low voice. He stands in front of the mirror, testing phrases like a man choosing the gentlest possible blade. Firm but fair, he tells himself. Jackie peeks in once, her presence quiet and steady. She places a hand on his shoulder and says, "Just tell them the truth, but kindly." Day 8. Evening. He delivers the speech. The world listens. Radios hum in kitchens, bars, and barracks. He speaks slowly, each sentence separated by breath. When he says, "This government has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba," hearts thud across continents. In Moscow, Khrushchev sets down his teacup mid-sip. In Havana, Castro leans forward on the sofa, the glow of the television flickering against his beard. For one long minute after the broadcast ends, even the crickets of Washington seem to pause. Day 9. The blockade line forms like a thin necklace around the Caribbean. American destroyers idle under the sun, their crews scanning horizons through binoculars. Somewhere among the waves, Soviet cargo ships approach. Each mile they travel feels heavier than the last. Kennedy spends the day waiting for reports, not decisions, just waiting. Leadership, he realizes, is mostly patience disguised as action. Day 10. The ships slow. Then miraculously, they turn. They do not cross the line. In the Situation Room, someone exhales loudly enough to earn a glare. The tension doesn't break. It softens. Kennedy walks to the window and sees leaves swirling on the lawn. For the first time in days, he notices they're beautiful. Day 11. Khrushchev's first long letter arrives, rambling, emotional, half plea, half lecture. He writes, "You and I ought not now to pull on the ends of a rope in which the knot of war is tied." Kennedy reads it aloud twice, admiring the strange poetry of it. "It's not elegant English," he murmurs, "but it's honest." He decides to answer in the same tone, respectful, restrained, human. Day 12. A second letter arrives, harsher than the first. Different handwriting, different mood. Khrushchev's advisors have edited him overnight. Now the words clatter like boots instead of footsteps. Kennedy has to choose which letter to believe. The angry one or the hopeful one. He chooses hope. It's the most underestimated form of intelligence. Day 13. Sunday morning. A clear sky, the kind that almost dares you to worry. Robert Kennedy meets secretly with the Soviet ambassador, Anatoly Dobrynin, in a small office at the Justice Department. They speak in low voices. Robert offers the quiet trade, missiles out of Cuba, and in a few months, US missiles withdrawn from Turkey. No boast, no signatures, just trust in words. Dobrynin nods, trembling slightly, and says, "We shall transmit this at once." Outside, church bells ring across Washington, their notes falling like slow rain. That night, Khrushchev sends the message everyone has been praying for. It begins simply, in order to eliminate as rapidly as possible the conflict which endangers the cause of peace. The missiles will be removed. In the White House, a cheer almost erupts, but Kennedy stops it with a raised hand. "Quiet," he says. "Let's make sure it's real." Old habits of caution die slowly. The next morning's newspapers shout relief. Crisis eases. World steps back from nuclear war. But Kennedy barely glances at the headlines. He's too tired to celebrate. He tells his secretary, "Let's just keep it calm." No gloating. Even victory, he knows, can be too loud. Across the Atlantic, Khrushchev reads reports of American restraint and smiles for the first time in weeks. He tells his aides, "We showed them our strength. Now we show them our sanity." In Havana, Castro feels something more complicated. He isn't consulted about the final deal. His pride smolders. Yet that night, as fireworks crack faintly along the Malecon, he steps outside and watches the reflections ripple on the water. Perhaps he senses that survival, too, can be a kind of revolution. Meanwhile, in living rooms from New York to Moscow, families exhale in unison. Mothers make breakfast again without thinking about fallout shelters. Children return to school, humming songs instead of emergency drills. The tension dissolves like sugar in warm tea. When historians later named those events the 13 days, they meant urgency. But listening here in the quiet, we can rename them differently. 13 nights the world learned how to wait. Every hour of restraint became its own kind of miracle. It's strange, isn't it, that the mightiest nations on earth were saved not by power, but by pauses. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear the rhythm of those pauses. The click of a typewriter key in the White House, the soft tearing of an envelope in the Kremlin, the steady breathing of soldiers who never received the order to fire. Each sound an act of mercy, each silence a verse in the lullaby of survival. Late that final night, Kennedy returned to his private residence. He poured himself a small glass of whiskey, not for celebration, but reflection. He stood by the window, looking toward the dim outline of the Washington Monument. Jackie joined him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "Is it over?" she asked. He nodded. Then, after a pause, "For now." They said nothing more. The night outside was cool and still. Somewhere, a dog barked once, uncertainly, as if testing whether it was safe to make noise again. And far away, in Moscow, Khrushchev did almost the same. He dismissed his aides, removed his shoes, and sat by the window of his dacha outside the city. Snow was beginning to fall. Thin, tentative flakes. He thought of his grandchildren, of the fields where he'd once worked as a farmer. He whispered to no one, "We did not burn the crop this time." Then he closed his eyes and listened to the muffled hush of snow meeting ground. Those 13 quiet days left marks we still carry. Hotlines established between capitals, treaties signed, egos slightly humbled. But their real legacy is simpler. The discovery that caution can be an act of courage. The men who waited saved more lives than any warrior who charged. So, as you lie here beneath your own calm ceiling, think of those distant rooms filled with tired men in suits, their ties loosened, their coffee gone cold. Think of how many ways there are to step back from an edge. And if you ever feel your own world tightening, your own days rushing towards some imagined brink, remember that even history once slowed down long enough to sleep. Let the ticking of your clock be the typewriter of diplomacy, steady and forgiving. Let the hum outside your window be the engines of ships turning homeward. And let the softness in your breath be the echo of that global exhale in 1962, when morning arrived and nothing exploded, and everyone, everywhere, was quietly grateful. Now, keep that gratitude near as we drift toward our final chapter. A closing meditation on peace itself, on what it means when nations like people choose rest instead of rage. But before we go, take one more slow breath. Feel how the world is always one decision away from calm. That's the true ending of those 13 days. Not triumph, not defeat, just the return of ordinary life, and the chance to dream again. Good evening, my friend, or perhaps good night. If your eyelids are already half closed, let them stay that way. We're at the final turning of this long, quiet story, the moment when the world decided, after trembling for 13 days, that it was time to rest. Before we begin, take a slow breath. Let it travel all the way down to your chest, where your heartbeat keeps time with the rhythm of this story. Now exhale, and imagine the year 1962, fading like a photograph left in sunlight. The crisis is over. The telegrams have stopped clicking. The ships are turning home. But the air still hums with the echo of what almost was. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended not with applause, but with the kind of quiet found after a long storm. That fragile, trembling calm when you realize the thunder has moved on. In Washington, President John F. Kennedy sat alone in the Oval Office. The ashtray beside him was full, the coffee cold. He looked at the globe on his desk again, the same one he'd spun in earlier days. It turned slowly under his hand, continents gliding past like gentle waves. He whispered something that no aide ever recorded, perhaps a prayer, perhaps a sigh, and leaned back, eyes half closed. For the first time in 2 weeks, he allowed himself to be human again. Across the ocean, in Moscow, Nikita Khrushchev did the same. He set down his glasses, rubbed his eyes, and smiled in a way only exhaustion can teach. He had sent his final letter that morning, the one agreeing to withdraw the missiles from Cuba. No one would ever call him a poet, yet the letter read almost like one. "We have lived to see a wise decision," he wrote, "not a foolish one." When his secretary left the room, Khrushchev took off his shoes, stretched his legs beneath the desk, and listened to the creak of the old wooden floor. The sound pleased him. It meant the world was still standing. Meanwhile, in Havana, the evening breeze carried the scent of salt and tobacco. Fidel Castro stood on the balcony of the presidential palace, cigar glowing like a small ember of stubborn pride. Below him, the city pulsed with relief, not celebration, just life continuing. Street vendors called out again, radios played slow love songs, and children chased each other through the alleys. Somewhere along the seawall, Che Guevara walked alone, his boots brushing against loose stones. He was thoughtful, perhaps disappointed that revolution had given way to compromise. Yet even he must have felt it. That strange peace that settles after surviving something enormous. He stopped, looked out at the moonlit sea, and murmured, "The tide comes in, the tide goes out." It was his way of saying, "We endure." The world's newspapers filled their front pages with relief, but the real stories were quieter. A nurse in London wrote in her diary, "The patients are smiling again." A factory worker in Detroit bought his son an ice cream, because we still can. And somewhere in Siberia, a radio operator turned down the volume on the static and poured himself tea. He raised the cup toward the invisible west and said, "Zamir, to peace." No cameras caught that, but it might be the truest photograph of the whole affair. The days that followed were filled with small, healing gestures. In Washington, Robert Kennedy drafted a letter to thank the Soviet ambassador Dobrynin for his role in the secret talks. It ended simply, The future will remember those who kept their heads when all others demanded action. In Moscow, Khrushchev ordered the construction of a direct hotline, a red telephone that would connect the two capitals so no future crisis would depend on slow cables or misunderstandings. When the line was tested months later, the first message was surprisingly poetic. The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog. A sentence chosen to test every letter of the alphabet, and perhaps unintentionally to remind the world that even politics has room for small jokes. But beyond diplomacy, something subtler changed. The Cold War was still cold, yes, but frost had begun to melt at the edges. Scientists began speaking again at conferences. Artists exchanged exhibitions, and American and Soviet ships occasionally passed each other with cautious waves. Fear had not vanished, but it had learned manners. Let's step back into those moments. The early winter of 1962. Imagine the streets of Washington after midnight. Snow flurries drift down onto the empty avenue leading to the White House. A lone guard walks his post, his breath rising in small clouds. Through one lit window, you can see Kennedy at his desk, writing thank you notes to his closest advisors. He signs them simply, Jack. Somewhere nearby, a clock strikes 2. The sound is steady, reassuring. The city sleeps again. Now, drift to Moscow. The Kremlin's towers glow against a curtain of falling snow. Inside, Khrushchev sits with his son Sergei, drinking tea. They talk not about politics, but about bread, about the harvest, about the stubborn cat that keeps stealing fish from the kitchen. The conversation is ordinary, domestic, blessedly dull. In that dullness lies the real victory, the proof that normal life, however small, has returned. And back in Cuba, dawn rises golden over the sugar fields. The missile sites are being dismantled. Soviet engineers load the long, silent tubes onto ships bound for home. Cuban soldiers stand by, watching in silence. Some feel proud, others uneasy, but all share the same strange fatigue. The exhaustion of people who've stared too long at the idea of extinction and decided quietly to keep living. One of them hums a tune under his breath, an old worker's song that drifts across the field like smoke. Even the birds seem to listen. Later that week, Kennedy addressed the nation again, this time in gentler tones. He thanked the American people for their patience, praised their calm, and, in a rare moment of vulnerability, said, "We all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal." The line was simple, but it rippled outward like a lullaby. It made even the staunchest generals pause and remember what all the maps and missiles had been trying to protect. Historians call that moment de-escalation. I prefer a softer phrase, the long exhale. For years, people had lived under the shadow of mushroom clouds, afraid to even imagine a peaceful dawn. And now, at least for a while, dawn had returned. It was imperfect, fragile, human, but it was enough. Imagine the sound of the world sleeping after that storm. In Florida, waves whispering against the shore. In Cuba, the hum of cicadas in the cane fields. In Moscow, the steady click of a typewriter turned off at last. And in every home where parents tuck their children into bed, the same quiet thought repeated like prayer. We're still here. Che Guevara once wrote that revolutionaries are lovers of humanity. Perhaps, for one fleeting moment, even the enemies of that era remembered that truth. They did not shake hands, but they shared a silence thicker than treaties, gentler than speeches. It was the sound of the world choosing sleep over fire, There's something tender in that choice. The collective instinct to stop, to breathe, to wait. It reminds me of the submarine officer Vasily Arkhipov, sitting in the dark belly of the B-59, refusing to launch his nuclear torpedo. No one outside his crew knew his name for decades, yet his calm may have saved everyone who followed. History is full of such unsung pauses. Perhaps you have your own. Moments when you could have shouted but didn't, when you chose quiet over combustion. That too is peace. In the months that followed, both nations turned their energy toward space. A race still full of competition, but one aimed upward instead of inward. For once, the rockets launched carried not warheads, but dreams. It's comforting to think that the same minds which built missiles later built moon landers. Progress, after all, is just fear rearranged into curiosity. The Cuban Missile Crisis became a story retold in classrooms and documentaries, but its heart remains something simpler than politics. A reminder that even at the edge of annihilation, empathy can whisper louder than pride. When Kennedy and Khrushchev finally exchanged their last letters on the matter, both ended the same way, with gratitude. It's not the ending anyone predicted, yet perhaps the only one the world could truly rest with. So now, as this tale unwinds to its close, imagine the Earth from far above, the way those U-2 pilots saw it, fragile and glowing. No borders visible, just blue and green and swirling white. The same view that made astronauts years later say, "You can't see enemies from up here." Maybe that was the truest outcome of 1962, a reminder of how small and how precious this shared home really is. Let your thoughts drift across that glowing planet, over Washington's domes, over Moscow's spires, over Havana's harbor, over the endless Atlantic that once divided, now connecting them with invisible lines of radio and memory. The wind moves gently over it all, not the wind of missiles, but the quiet wind of forgiveness. And if the story has softened you, that's good. It should. Because what we've really been talking about all along isn't politics or power. It's the miracle of restraint. The way human beings, with all their flaws, can still choose kindness when history demands anger. That's why the world is still turning, and why you, right now, can rest without fear. So close your eyes a little tighter. Hear the faint crackle of a fireplace, the low hum of distant waves. Maybe, somewhere deep in your imagination, you can still sense Kennedy writing one last note before bed, or Khrushchev turning off his lamp, or Castro staring at the horizon, unsure whether to trust the quiet, but letting it wash over him anyway. Each of them, in their own way, drifting toward sleep. The same sleep you're drifting toward now. May these memories guide you into peaceful dreams. And if this calm journey has helped you unwind, you can tap like and subscribe. Only if it feels right. For now, rest easy. You live in a world that once almost ended, but didn't, because for 13 fragile days, people chose patience. And patience, dear listener, is the softest form of courage. Good night, and sweet dreams.